The phone lit up while the shower was still running. That was the first thing I noticed, the timing. Daniel never left his phone unattended, not even for a minute. It was always within reach, always face down, always silent. But that night, it was sitting on the edge of the nightstand screen, glowing softly in the dim bedroom light, like it had been waiting for me. I wasn't even trying to look. I had come upstairs to grab my glasses. That was it, a normal, forgettable movement in a normal, forgettable evening. The kind of moment that usually passes without leaving a trace. But the light caught my eye. A message. No name, just a small, pale symbol where a contact should have been, and beneath it, a preview that didn't belong in my life. I didn't pick up the phone right away. I stood there for a second, listening to the steady rush of water behind the bathroom door, trying to convince myself I had misread it, that it was work, that it was something harmless, that there was still a version of this moment where nothing had changed. Then I reached for it. The screen woke instantly, as if it recognized my hesitation. One line, short, casual, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten before my mind could catch up. It wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. Some messages don't explain themselves. They assume you already understand. And I didn't, not yet. But I understood enough to know this wasn't new. There was a tone to it, a rhythm, the kind that comes from repetition, from conversations that have been happening quietly, consistently, somewhere just out of sight. I became aware of the room again, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint creak of the house settling around me, the sound of water still running behind the door. Everything felt the same, but it wasn't. I turned the phone over in my hand, suddenly aware of how foreign it felt. 8 years of marriage, and I realized standing there in our bedroom that I didn't actually know what lived inside this device he never let out of his sight. The water shut off. I froze. For a moment, I considered putting it back exactly where I found it, pretending I had never seen it, letting whatever this was stay exactly where it had been hidden, contained separate from the life I thought I was living. That would have been easier, cleaner, but something had already shifted. You don't unsee a message like that. You don't unknow what it implies. I unlocked the screen. The thread was already open. The message sat there waiting. And before I could think it through, before I could talk myself out of it, my thumb moved. I typed exactly the way Daniel would. Short, direct, no hesitation. I didn't ask questions. I didn't accuse. I didn't even pause long enough to consider what I might be stepping into. I just sent one message, an invitation, to my house. The water turned back on for a second, then stopped again, pipes settling, the sound echoing faintly through the walls. I stared at the screen, my heartbeat slow and heavy, like something deep and deliberate had just been set into motion. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Whoever she was, she had been waiting. I set the phone back exactly where I'd found it, not a millimeter off, screen down, slight angle toward the lamp, the way Daniel always left it, like even the position had rules I wasn't supposed to question. By the time the bathroom door opened, I was already at the dresser, sliding my glasses on as if that had been my only reason for coming upstairs. "Hey," he said, toweling his hair, his voice easy, familiar. I turned, gave him the same small smile I had given him 1,000 times before. "Hey." Nothing in his face had changed. That was the part I couldn't reconcile. There was no tension, no hesitation, no flicker of anything that suggested a second life waiting quietly just outside the edges of mine. He moved past me, dropped the towel on the chair, he never hung it up, and reached for his phone without looking at me. A quick glance at the screen, a pause so brief it would have been invisible if I hadn't been watching for it. Then he flipped it over again. "Call's about to start," he said, already halfway out the door. "Late one, I asked." He shrugged. "Different time zone." He said it the same way he always did, casual, practiced, unbothered. The kind of answer that ended conversations without inviting more questions. I nodded like I always did. "Don't wait up," he added. "I won't." The office door clicked shut down the hall, and just like that, the house settled back into silence. It should have felt normal. For years, this had been our rhythm. Daniel working late, me finishing up whatever I'd brought home from the office, both of us moving around each other in a quiet, predictable pattern that had come to define our marriage. We weren't dramatic people. We didn't fight. We didn't make scenes. We handled things. At least that's what I had always believed. I walked back downstairs, my steps steady, my hands surprisingly calm. The kitchen still looked the same, clean counters, the mail stacked neatly by the fruit bowl. My laptop open where I'd left it earlier. Everything was in its place, everything except the part I had just discovered. I sat at the island and tried to focus on something concrete, number spreadsheets, anything that made sense. That had always been my way, find the structure, follow the logic, and everything else eventually fell into place. But this didn't fit. It wasn't just the message, it was what it implied. The ease of it, the familiarity, the absence of secrecy in the way it had appeared, like it wasn't something new or fragile, but something established routine. I thought back carefully, methodically. The late meetings, the phone that never left his hand, the way he had started stepping outside to take calls even in the middle of dinner. The passwords that had quietly changed months ago explained away with something about security updates at work. None of it had seemed urgent at the time. That was the unsettling part. Not that I had ignored signs, but that they hadn't felt like signs at all. Just small adjustments in a life that had always been stable. We had built that stability deliberately. 8 years. A house we'd chosen together. Careers that ran on parallel tracks, his in commercial real estate, mine in compliance. We understood systems, contracts, boundaries, or at least I thought we did. I reached for my tea, then stopped when I realized it had gone cold. Upstairs, I could hear the low murmur of Daniel's voice through the office door, even controlled professional. If I hadn't seen the message, I would have assumed it was exactly what he said. It was a conference call, nothing more. I sat there for a long time, not moving, letting the pieces shift into place without forcing them. Because forcing them would mean reacting, and reacting meant losing control. I wasn't ready to do that, not yet. Instead, I replayed the message in my mind. Not the words themselves, but the tone, the expectation behind it. The assumption that whatever connection existed there, it was understood. Ongoing, unquestioned. That was what stayed with me, not what he had done, but how long it must have been happening without me ever seeing it clearly. I glanced toward the staircase, then back at my laptop, at the neat rows of numbers waiting for me to make sense of them. I couldn't fix this the same way, not by analyzing it from a distance. If there was something real there, something structured, something repeated, then it would leave traces. It already had. I just hadn't been looking in the right place, and now for the first time, I was. The 3 dots didn't disappear. They stayed there longer than they should have, blinking in and out like a quiet signal that whoever was on the other end wasn't surprised by the message, just deciding how to answer it. I didn't move. My phone rested flat against the kitchen island, the screen still open, my own reflection faintly visible over the text thread. I could hear Daniel's voice upstairs, steady and measured, slipping in and out of the kind of tone he used for clients, controlled, professional, distant, separate. That was the word that kept coming back to me. Separate from this. The dots vanished. Then a reply appeared, short, immediate, no hesitation. It wasn't the words themselves that made my chest tighten. It was the ease of it, the assumption that the message made sense, that this, whatever this was already understood between them. No confusion, no follow-up questions, just confirmation. I read it twice slower the second time. There was something embedded in it. Not obvious, not loud, but there, if you were paying attention. A reference, not to tonight, but to before. To familiarity, to access. My fingers hovered over the screen, the instinct to pull back rising just enough to be noticeable. This was the point where I could still stop, close the thread, put the phone back in Daniel's hand, and let whatever this was continue without me naming it, without me stepping into it. But that would mean staying on the outside, and I wasn't sure I could do that anymore. I exhaled slowly and started typing again. I kept it simple. Daniel never over-explained. He didn't leave room for interpretation when he was trying to sound busy. I'd seen it in his emails, his texts, the way he managed conversations like tasks efficient contained. I matched that. No emotion, no detail, just direction. Come by, side door. It's unlocked. I read it once, adjusting a word, then again making sure nothing in it sounded like me. Then I sent it. The moment it went through, something shifted, not outside, not in the house, but in me. A quiet, irreversible line crossed without any visible marker. This wasn't observation anymore. This was participation. The reply came faster this time. No hesitation at all. On my way. I stared at the screen, letting the words settle. On my way. Not who is this, not is everything okay, not even are you sure, just movement, just compliance. Whoever she was, this wasn't new territory for her. I locked the phone and set it back upstairs exactly where it had been. Same angle. Same distance from the edge of the nightstand. The kind of detail that shouldn't matter but suddenly did. Daniel's office door was still closed. His voice carried faintly through it, steady, uninterrupted. If he had checked his phone again, he hadn't said anything. No pause, no break in rhythm. Nothing had changed, except everything had. I went back downstairs and stood in the middle of the living room, looking around as if I were seeing it for the first time. The couch we picked out together, the framed photo from Asheville on the mantel, the bookshelf organized by subject, not color, my system, not his. It all looked the same, but there was a new question layered over it now. Not what this space meant to me, but what it meant to someone else. I moved to the side door and checked the lock. It clicked open easily, just like it always did. No resistance, no sign that it had been used recently or often, but locks don't tell stories. People do. I stepped back, letting the door rest closed but not secured. An invitation, clear, direct, the kind that assumes it will be accepted. I glanced at the clock on the wall. If she was already on her way, then whatever this was, whatever had been happening quietly, repeatedly outside of my awareness, was about to walk through that door. And for the first time since the phone lit up upstairs, I realized something that hadn't fully formed until now. I wasn't waiting to catch him. I was waiting to understand the shape of what he had built without me. The house had never felt this quiet before. Not empty, not peaceful, just aware. I stood in the middle of the living room for a moment longer than necessary, listening, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for something to shift, something to confirm that what I had just set in motion was real. Upstairs, Daniel's voice carried faintly through the closed office door, steady and uninterrupted. Whatever call he was on, it was holding his full attention. That at least hadn't changed. Everything else had. I moved slowly, deliberately, like any sudden motion might disturb something fragile I couldn't yet see. My gaze passed over the same objects it had 100 times before: the couch, the framed photos, the lamp by the corner chair. Nothing was out of place, but now I wasn't looking for what was there. I was looking for what didn't belong. I walked toward the kitchen, my fingers brushing lightly against the cool surface of the island where my phone had rested minutes ago. The screen was dark now, still, as if nothing had happened, but something had. Someone was on their way. I checked the clock again. Too soon. If she had replied that quickly, if she had left immediately, then she either lived nearby or she had been close already. The thought settled in slowly, without drama, but with a weight that was hard to ignore. Close? Not across town, not somewhere distant or hidden, close enough that an invitation like that didn't require planning. I exhaled, steady, controlled the way I had trained myself to do in moments that required precision. Panic didn't help. Emotion blurred details, and details were the only thing I had right now. I walked to the side door again. It looked exactly the same as it always had. A simple white frame, a narrow window, the handle worn just enough to show years of use. I placed my hand on it, feeling the faint coolness of the metal. Unlocked, just like I had said. I opened it slightly, just enough to check the hinge. No resistance, no unusual sound. Then I closed it again, leaving it exactly as it had been, ready but not obvious. An entrance, not hidden, not secret, just available. I stepped back and let my eyes adjust to the room again. For a moment, I tried to imagine it from the outside, not as my home, but as a place someone else might be entering. What would they expect to see? What version of Daniel had been described to them? What version of this house? The thought didn't spike into anger the way I expected it to. It stayed quieter than that, colder, more contained, structured, like a problem waiting to be mapped. I moved to the bookshelf and adjusted a single spine that was slightly out of line. It didn't need fixing. I just needed something to do with my hands. Upstairs, a chair scraped faintly across the floor. Daniel shifting, still talking, still unaware. I glanced toward the staircase, then back at the door. Nothing yet. The waiting stretched not long enough to be measured in hours, but long enough to distort the sense of time. Every small sound carried more weight than it should have: the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the wall clock, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Then, a shadow moved across the narrow window of the side door, not clearly, just enough to register. I didn't react immediately. I watched it still and quiet, letting my mind confirm what my eyes had already seen. Someone was there, not knocking, not leaving, just standing close enough to be seen. My hand lowered slowly to my side, my breath steady but deeper now, my awareness narrowing to a single point in the room. The door. This was the moment I had set in motion, and for the first time the question shifted. Not who she was, but why she hadn't knocked. She didn't knock. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Not hesitant, not unsure, just waiting. Close enough to the glass that I could see the outline of her shoulder, the faint shift of weight from one foot to the other. Someone who expected the door to open without needing to announce herself, like she had done this before. I stepped forward, each movement measured, controlled, the way you move when you already know something has changed but haven't named it yet. My hand reached the handle. For a second, I paused, not out of fear, but because this was the last moment where everything still existed in theory, where the message upstairs could still be misread, misinterpreted, dismissed. Once the door opened, that possibility would disappear. I turned the handle. The door swung inward, and the woman standing there did not match anything I had prepared for. She wasn't dressed for secrecy, no oversized sunglasses, no guarded expression, no sign of someone stepping into something hidden or illicit. She stood straight, composed her posture, professional rather than cautious. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back neatly, a structured coat tailored not trendy. One hand held a slim leather portfolio, the kind used in meetings, not late-night visits. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief moment something flickered across her face. Not guilt, not panic, recognition. Not of me, of the space. "Hi," she said, her voice even polite. I wasn't sure if I should just come in. There was no hesitation in the way she said it, no apology, as if the question wasn't whether she belonged here, but whether she should wait to be invited. I didn't move aside. "Can I help you?" I asked. The words came out steady, neutral, caring none of what was building underneath. She glanced past me just slightly into the hallway, into the living room beyond. Not searching, confirming. "Yes," she said. "I'm here to see Daniel." Not Daniel Carter, not your husband, just Daniel. Familiar, direct. I felt something shift again, not sharp this time, but deeper. A slow internal adjustment. "How do you know him?" I asked. Her grip tightened slightly on the portfolio, not defensive, reflexive. "Work," she said. "We've been coordinating on a property matter. He asked me to stop by tonight." Property. The word didn't land right away. It didn't fit the shape of what I had been expecting. Not personal, not emotional, structured, documented. I stepped back just enough to allow her inside. "Come in," I said. She entered without hesitation, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had already mapped the space in her mind. Her eyes moved briefly across the living room, the couch, the mantel, the photos, taking it in, not with curiosity, but with assessment, like she was verifying something she had already been told. I closed the door behind her. The sound clicked softly, final in a way that felt disproportionate to the motion. She turned toward me, extending a hand. Claire Benton, she said. Transaction coordinator. We've been going over the ownership details. Ownership! The second time the word appeared, this time it didn't pass through me. It stayed. I didn't take her hand. I'm Olivia, I said. I didn't add anything else. For the first time, her expression shifted not dramatically but enough. A pause, a recalculation. Olivia, she repeated slower. I wasn't aware he had someone else involved in this part of the process. Someone else, not wife, not partner, just someone. I held her gaze. What part of the process is that? I asked. She opened the portfolio, smooth practice pulling out a set of documents clipped neatly together. Papers that had been prepared, organized, finalized enough to be carried into someone else's home. This property, she said, gesturing lightly around us. The transfer structure Daniel's been working on. Transfer. Structure. Working on. The room felt smaller. Not physically, but in the way that something invisible had just taken up space inside it. I just need to confirm a few details. She continued, unaware or not yet aware of the shift that had already begun. We're on a tight timeline, so he asked me to come by directly instead of waiting until morning. Morning, as if this had been scheduled, as if this visit was part of something ongoing, planned, normal. I looked at the papers in her hand, then back at her, and for the first time since the message appeared on Daniel's phone, the question changed shape again. Not who she was, not what he had done, but what exactly he had been building. Claire didn't seem to notice how still I had become. She laid the documents on the kitchen island with the calm precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. Pages aligned, tabs visible, a cover sheet clipped neatly on top. Nothing about her suggested secrecy or scandal. She looked like a woman finishing a task at the end of a long workday, not someone standing in the middle of another woman's marriage. That more than anything unsettled me, because affairs lived in shadows. This didn't. This had paper. Claire slid the top page toward me and tapped the margin with one manicured finger. These are the revised ownership drafts, she said. Daniel said he wanted to move quickly, so I went ahead and consolidated the latest changes. Revised. Latest changes. I looked down, not because I understood what I was seeing yet, but because I needed my face pointed somewhere other than hers. There was my address at the top, my house. The one Daniel and I had bought our first winter in Charlotte, when mortgage rates were low and we still believed every major decision we made would be one we made together. I knew every crack in the driveway, every stubborn cabinet hinge, every place the afternoon light landed in the living room. I had signed papers for this house, sat at a closing table for this house, chosen paint colors and shrubs and insurance coverage for this house. And yet the page in front of me made it look strangely administrative, like it was no longer the center of a life but an asset being repositioned. Claire kept talking, filling the silence with the language a process. He said the structure changed after the title review. Nothing too unusual. It just meant reworking the transfer path before the next filing window. Transfer path. Filing window. The words didn't belong in the room, and yet there they were, laid across my kitchen island like silverware set for dinner. I lifted my eyes to her. What exactly is being transferred? For the first time since she walked in, Claire hesitated, only slightly, just enough to suggest she had assumed more shared knowledge than she should have. The beneficial interest, she said carefully. At least that's how he framed it. He said he needed the occupancy and ownership arrangement cleaned up before month end. Month end. Not someday. Not in theory. Soon. A pressure I hadn't fully named until then settled hard into my chest. This wasn't a flirtation that might burn out on its own. This wasn't a private betrayal sitting off to the side of my life like some ugly but contained infection. This had trajectory. It had deadlines. It had someone in a wool coat standing in my kitchen with a portfolio full of paperwork. I rested both hands on the counter to steady myself. And who did he say was taking occupancy? Claire looked at me more directly now. Really looked. The photos on the mantel, the dishes in the drying rack. My laptop bag by the chair, the kind of details a person stops seeing when they assume they understand a room. Her expression changed not dramatically, but enough for me to know something was no longer fitting. He told me, she said slowly, that the house was in transition, that the current living arrangement had already been resolved. Resolved. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so brutally clean, such a polished, bloodless word for erasing someone. Resolved how I asked. Claire straightened, a small defensive shift coming into her posture now, as though she was beginning to sense that she had walked into something outside the tidy boundaries of her role. Mrs. Olivia, I'm not here to discuss his personal life. I'm only handling the documentation he requested. There it was, the first retreat, professional distance, narrowed responsibility, the instinct to step backward from a fire while pretending she hadn't felt the heat. But she hadn't left. And I wasn't going to let this fold back into silence. Then handle it, I said, my voice quieter than I expected. Tell me whose name is supposed to replace mine. That landed. I saw it in the way her fingers tightened over the edge of the folder, in the pause that followed, in the faint crease that formed between her brows. She hadn't come here expecting resistance. She certainly hadn't expected accuracy, because now the shape of Daniel's other life was beginning to show, not as romance, not as lust, not even as betrayal in the ordinary sense. He hadn't just lied to me, he had been organizing my disappearance, and Claire, whether she meant to or not, was holding the outline of it in her hands. Claire didn't answer right away. For the first time since she stepped into my house, the confidence in her posture faltered, not dramatically, but enough to expose something underneath it. Not uncertainty about her work, uncertainty about the situation, about me. Her eyes dropped to the documents in her hands, scanning something she had likely reviewed dozens of times before. But now she wasn't reading for accuracy, she was reading for alignment, and it wasn't there. I think, she began, then stopped, choosing her next words carefully. I think there may be some confusion about how this was presented. Confusion. The word landed lightly, almost professionally neutral, but nothing about this was neutral. Then clear it up, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Claire took a breath and pulled one of the pages free from the stack. She turned it slightly so I could see the section she was referencing, her finger resting just above a line of typed text. This is the preliminary ownership adjustment, she said. It hasn't been finalized, but it outlines the intended change in structure. I followed her hand. There were names, Daniel's, of course, and another, not mine. I didn't react, not outwardly, not yet. Instead, I focused on the details the way I always had when something didn't make sense, line by line, word by word, legal language, conditional phrasing. But the intent was clear. Someone else was being positioned to step into a role that had until this moment never been described as temporary. And where I asked, keeping my eyes on the page, was I in this structure, Claire didn't answer immediately. That silence was louder than anything she could have said. She shifted her weight slightly, her grip on the paper tightening just enough to crease the edge. Daniel indicated that the existing arrangement had already been transitioned. Another clean word, another erasure disguised as process. I let out a slow breath and lifted my gaze to meet hers. Transition to what? Her expression tightened, professionalism pulling back into place like a shield. Mrs. Carter, I'm not authorized to speak on anything beyond the documentation I was provided. Mrs. Carter. The title came back now. Not recognition, correction. Too late. Then speak to the documentation, I said, because from where I'm standing it looks like my name disappears without my involvement. That landed harder. Claire's eyes flicked back to the page, then to me, recalculating in real time. This wasn't a misunderstanding she could smooth over with standard language. The facts didn't allow it, and for the first time I saw something else in her expression. Not just discomfort, concern. This wasn't presented to me as a contested situation, she said, her voice lower now. I was told all parties were aligned. All parties. I almost smiled at that. How many parties do you think there are? I asked. She didn't answer. because now she knew, not everything but enough. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, Daniel moving, still unaware of the shift happening below him. I stepped closer to the island, closing the distance between us just enough to change the dynamic. You said this wasn't finalized, I said. What's the next step? Claire hesitated again, but this time it wasn't about me. It was about the process she had walked into and the risk attached to it. Submission, she said finally. There's a filing window at the end of the week. If the documents are signed and submitted, it moves forward. End of the week, not months from now, not hypothetical, immediate. And if they're not, I asked. It stalls, she said. Nothing changes until it's resubmitted. Nothing changes. The phrase echoed differently than she intended, because something had already changed. I straightened the pieces, settling into place not as a solution, but as a boundary, a line. Daniel hadn't just created a second version of his life, he had started moving pieces in mine, without me, without notice, without consent, and now there was a deadline attached to it. I looked at the documents one last time, then back at Claire. You should stay, I said. The words came out steady, deliberate, leaving no space for interpretation. Her brows drew together. I'm sorry. You came here to finish something, I continued, so let's finish it. Upstairs, I heard the office door open, footsteps, approaching. Claire turned her head slightly toward the sound, then back to me, something like hesitation, real hesitation finally breaking through. This wasn't the controlled environment she had expected. This was something else, something unresolved, something about to surface. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't waiting anymore. I was positioning. Daniel came into the kitchen, still holding the end of his headset cord in one hand, his attention half behind him, half on whatever sentence he had just finished upstairs. He stopped when he saw Claire, not in the exaggerated way people do in movies. No dramatic stumble, no dropped glass, no loud denial. Just a clean, unmistakable interruption, as if his body had reached the truth a second before his face did. His eyes went to her first, then to the folder on the island, then to me, and in that sequence I saw it happen. Calculation. Not surprise at seeing Claire in the house, surprise at seeing her here with me. Olivia, he said too quickly, I thought you were downstairs working. I was, I said, and he set the headset on the counter beside the fruit bowl, careful, deliberate, buying himself those few extra seconds people take when they need their hands occupied so their face can catch up. Claire didn't speak. Whatever assumptions she had walked in with had already been stripped down enough for silence to feel safer than professionalism. Daniel looked at her again. Claire, I didn't know you were coming tonight. It was a good lie, simple, smooth, placed where a weaker person might accept it just to avoid the humiliation of pushing back. But there was the message, the invitation, the urgency, and now the documents opened between us like a wound that had already started to bleed. She came because you asked her to, I said. His gaze slid to me sharper now. I have no idea what you're talking about. That was his first mistake. Too broad, too fast. Denial before inquiry. Not confusion defense. I saw Claire notice it too. Her shoulders drew back slightly, not with confidence but with distance. The first instinct of someone realizing she may need to protect herself. I rested my hand lightly on the papers. Then let's stay with what we do know. Daniel's jaw tightened. Flavia, this is business. You're making this into something it isn't. Business. I almost admired the nerve of it, not because it was clever, but because it revealed the shape of his thinking. If he could move the conversation into language that sounded procedural, he could shrink me, reframe me, turn me into the emotional wife misreading a transaction she didn't understand. I had spent 8 years watching him do that in smaller ways, flattening discomfort with logic, stepping over objections by making them sound inefficient. Not tonight. Then explain the transaction, I said. Explain why my address is on those drafts. Explain why another name is being positioned inside my house. Claire's eyes moved to him fully now. There it was. The shift. Not alliance. Not trust. Just attention redirected to the person who had created the conflict. Daniel gave a short, controlled exhale and changed tactics. There's a restructuring issue tied to title review. It's temporary. Nothing has been filed. Temporary. Nothing has been filed. He had heard enough to know where the weak point was. Not the affair, not the lies, the process, the filing window, the deadline, the fact that incomplete paperwork was still incomplete. And that was when I understood my own mistake. I had been standing in the center of the betrayal, looking at the emotional damage because it was the most visible wound. But the real leverage wasn't in proving he had deceived me. It was in stopping what was still movable. Claire spoke at last, her voice quieter than before, but far more precise. "You told me all parties were aligned." Daniel turned to her with a look I recognized immediately, the one he used when he needed someone to doubt themselves before they doubted him. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "My wife isn't involved in the ownership side. This was supposed to be handled separately." My wife. Not Olivia now, not when he needed legitimacy. I felt something settle in me, not anger, not grief, but focus, separately. That was the word that mattered. He had counted on keeping every part of this separate. Me from the documents, Claire from the truth, process from consequence. So the answer wasn't chaos, it was connection. I straightened and looked at Claire, not him. "If nothing has been filed," I said, "then nothing moves tonight." "Correct." Daniel turned toward me at once too quickly to hide it. Claire noticed that too, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw her step fully out of his version of events and into the room as it actually was. "Yes," she said, "nothing moves tonight." That was not a victory, not yet, but it was the first thing that had stopped, and Daniel knew it. Daniel recovered faster than I expected. Not emotionally, structurally. I saw it in the way his shoulders squared and the way his voice settled into that polished register he used whenever he thought he could talk his way back into control. He looked at Claire first, not me, because he understood where the immediate risk was now. "Let's not overcomplicate this," he said. "Nothing has been filed and nothing was going to be filed tonight. Claire, you can leave the documents with me. I'll sort this out in the morning. Sort this out." As if this were a scheduling issue, a clerical misunderstanding, a loose thread he could still tuck back into place before anyone noticed the seam. Claire didn't move. That, more than anything, changed the room. Daniel noticed it too. His expression stayed smooth, but there was a new strain in it now, a tightening just below the surface. He was used to women accommodating him, adjusting around him, letting his tone define reality. Not tonight. "I can't leave them with you," Claire said carefully. "Not under these circumstances." He gave a short laugh, one meant to reduce the moment, make it feel smaller than it was. Under what circumstances? My wife overheard part of a transaction she wasn't involved in, and now we're making this into a crisis. There it was, again, his favorite trick. Not denial anymore, reframing. But Claire had the folder in her hands, and I had the house under my feet, and for the first time, Daniel was standing in a room where neither language nor charm could change the visible facts. I stepped closer to the island. "Say that again," I said, "that I'm not involved in what happens to my own address." His jaw flexed. "Olivia, stop." "No," I said, "you stop." The words came out cleaner than I felt. No shaking, no heat, just a boundary spoken aloud. Claire opened the folder again, flipping to the title review notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had stopped trying to be polite and started trying to be correct. "There's a representation issue," she said. "If occupancy and ownership weren't disclosed accurately, this can't move forward as drafted." Daniel turned toward her sharply. "That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time that night I saw him without the smoothing layer he always carried into conflict. No husband, no professional, just a man who had counted on timing omission and silence and suddenly had none of them. "It was preliminary," he said. "I was exploring options for what I asked." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Claire did. "This structure only makes sense if the current occupant is being removed from the ownership path," she said quietly. Removed. Not transitioned, not resolved. Removed. The word landed harder because it was plain. Daniel's face changed. Not dramatically, but enough. The calculation broke. For one brief second, there was no strategy left, only exposure. Claire closed the folder. "I'm withdrawing these drafts," she said, "and I'm documenting why." That was the sound of it turning, not a slam, not a scene, just a door closing somewhere he had assumed would stay open. Daniel took a step toward her. "Claire, don't be ridiculous." She met his eyes. "I'm being careful." Then she looked at me, not warmly, not apologetically, just clearly. "If the property is solely in your name, he had no basis to describe this as aligned. You should review everything he's touched." Everything he's touched. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't closure. It was worse than that. It was instruction. Daniel looked at me, then really looked at me, and I could see the moment he understood the shape of what he had lost. Not just the filing, not just the drafts, the advantage. He had built his second life on the assumption that I would stay one step behind it. I wasn't behind it anymore, and he knew it. Claire was the first to leave. She gathered the documents with the same care she had used when she laid them out, but there was a difference now. The folder was no longer part of a process moving forward. It was evidence of something stopped in time. At the door, she turned back once, not to apologize and not to explain, but to make one thing plain. "I'll note that the drafts were withdrawn before submission," she said. "Nothing moves unless new documents are prepared." Then she looked at Daniel, and whatever uncertainty had been left in her was gone. "You should have disclosed the truth." The door closed behind her with a soft click. Daniel and I stood in the kitchen in the quiet that followed, and for the first time all night there was nothing left to mediate the space between us. No paperwork, no third person, no professional language to hide inside. Just him, just me. He opened his mouth, and I could see him reaching for the version of this that might still save him. Regret. Confusion. Some rearrangement of tone that would let him step away from the edge without admitting how close he had come to pushing me out of my own life. I didn't let him begin. "You need to leave," I said. He stared at me as if the sentence had arrived too early, as if there was supposed to be another stage between exposure and consequence. Maybe in his mind there had always been one. A conversation, a delay, time enough to soften what he had done into something survivable. "This is my house too," he said, but even he sounded unconvinced. "No," I said, "it isn't." That was the simplest part of the night, and somehow the most important. No raised voice, no dramatic speech, just the truth, clean and final. He looked around, then not at me but at the room. At the counters, the frame photo from Asheville, the chair where he dropped his jacket every evening, the life he had moved through, like ownership and belonging, were the same thing. I watched him realize they weren't. He didn't argue after that, maybe because Claire's withdrawal had already broken the larger plan, maybe because he understood that if I had asked one question tonight, I could ask 10 more tomorrow. Maybe because, for the first time, he saw that silence was no longer working in his favor. He went upstairs and came back down with an overnight bag and a garment sleeve. It would have looked temporary if I hadn't known better, if I hadn't spent the last hour watching an entire hidden structure collapse. At the front door, he paused. "I never meant for it to happen like this," he said. That might have been true. But it wasn't the defense he thought it was. Harm rarely arrives in the form people intend. I held the door open. "I believe you," I said. "But you still meant for it to happen." He had no answer to that. When he finally stepped outside, I closed the door gently behind him and turned the lock. Not because I was afraid he would come back in, but because the act mattered. It marked the end of something I had not agreed to lose, and the return of something I had almost let be taken without a fight. The house was quiet again, not the strained quiet from earlier when everything felt like it was holding its breath. This was different, still fragile, still raw, but honest. I walked back into the kitchen and put my hand on the island where the folder had been. Same stone, same room, same light above the sink. Nothing looked transformed, but I was. I understood something then that I had missed for too many years. Stability is not the same as safety, and marriage is not the same as being seen. I had mistaken routine for protection, familiarity for trust, shared space for shared truth. What remained now was not the life I thought I had. It was something smaller, cleaner, and entirely mine, and for the first time that night, that felt like enough. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, I'd love to know what that moment looked like for you. If this story stayed with you, you can subscribe, or stay for the next one. Sometimes the next story doesn't continue the same life, but it does continue the same truth.